Welcome, everyone. I'm really excited today. We're going to talk about a topic that is very highly requested. So my name is Jess Reynolds. I'm a doctor of traditional Chinese medicine and acupuncture, also a massage therapist. I do some hypnotherapy, and I've got a couple of different businesses in the wellness field between my own private practice, as well as I do own a continuing education company. And over the years, I've found that one of the most valuable skills that I have developed in order to further my career is, well, it's business skills. And interacting with different students and other practitioners over the years, it's been fascinating because one of the most requested courses I get as a continuing education provider is business courses. And there was a period of time, about 8-9 years or so, I was teaching in a variety of different colleges, from massage colleges to acupuncture colleges and a nutrition college. And the same thing is we would teach all of these technical skills, right? I mean, that's what it's all about, learning how to do the techniques. But at the end of it, when people would graduate, they would oftentimes approach me and say, I'm just not prepared for the actual business aspect of it. So that's in part why I've created this little webinar, is to sort of do what I can to share the most basic aspects of business. So that's what we're going to go through today. Now, I do have a slideshow here. I'll just pop that up. There we go. Now, as we go through the slideshow, if you do have questions, please do put them in the Q&A and I'll get to them at the end. And for those of you, if there's any in the audience right now who did share questions beforehand, I've got all of those as well, and we'll do our best to make it through all of the questions. So let's just jump right in then. So the topics we're going to be covering today largely are going to be the very basics, like how do you really get started? And that's quite important, not only for those who are just starting out, but interestingly enough, a lot of people who have been doing this for a number of years, they might have some questions, or maybe there was a step missed in the starting the business process. We'll cover those basics. After that, we're going to talk about legalities. Now, legalities are a huge part of starting a business. And if you start by understanding the legalities, you save yourself a lot of headaches down the road. After that, we'll talk about a very common question, maybe the most common question I actually get, and that's the difference between a contractor and an employee. And in the wellness industry, that's actually an incredibly important distinction to make for a lot of reasons. And then we'll get into basic startup costs, whether or not you're going to be starting a home-based business or a mobile business, or maybe you want to start a brick and mortar. What are the common costs you can expect? And right on the feathers of that, or the tail feathers of that, we'll talk about loans and funding. Do you actually need it? How do you get it? And then lastly, we'll talk about assistance services. Where do you go if you have more business questions? Before we jump into that, very brief disclaimer. So what I am going to talk about, it's not legal advice. So if you're in doubt about any of this type of stuff, I strongly encourage you to ask a lawyer. And I'll be giving ideas and maybe suggestions, but ultimately it's up to you whether you choose to apply those suggestions or not. So it's not legal advice. And if you choose to do something that I've said, I don't want to take any responsibility, because a big part of this is there are so many different ways to do business. And my goal isn't to say this is the way to do it. My goal is to say, here are the ways to do it. And part of your job as the business owner is to identify which one of those pathways best suits your type of business. Okay, so we'll jump in to the absolute basics. Business structures, a big one, choosing your business name and registration. We'll start with business structures. So there are three main types of business structures. We have a sole proprietorship, we have a partnership, and then we've got corporations. We're going to talk about each one of these individually. And a lot of questions do come up with these, and there were a number of questions that came up beforehand for those that submitted them, having to do with business structures. And this really is one of the very first steps when you're starting your business, is to decide what type of business structure you actually want to have. And there's a big difference between them, pros and cons to each. We'll start with a sole proprietor or sole proprietorship. Now, a sole proprietorship, by its very name, is owned by one person. And that one person, well, it's just you. Now, there are some really big pros to this, and probably the biggest is it's very informal and it's incredibly easy to create. Now, I do want to dig into that just a little bit about how easy it is and how affordable it is to create. Basically, as a sole proprietor, if at any point in time you've sold a good or you've performed a service and you've accepted money, you're technically a sole proprietor. And this might have been that lemonade stand you started when you were a kid, or of course, as a practitioner, it might mean that you were still in school, you gave somebody a treatment for whatever modality of practice, and they gave you money. At that very moment, you become a business owner, technically speaking, and you are a sole proprietor. That's just how easy it is to start a business. And we could just leave it at that. We don't have to make it any more complicated, with some exceptions. And it all has to do with income threshold. How much money are you actually making? Now, these income thresholds, they vary significantly depending on the country you're in, and if you're in the United States, even depending on the state that you're in. And those income thresholds essentially mean, when do you have to start registering yourself as a business? So again, I reiterate, a sole proprietorship, well, that's probably you. And if you've never done anything with business, you've never gone to the registry or the IRS or anything like that and said, I want to start a business, we've accepted money, you're going to be a sole proprietor. So yeah, very informal, incredibly easy to create. And this is probably the biggest downside, is you are personally liable for debt. And that's the big one. So this is when it starts to get into, when should you and what should you do? When should you choose to register maybe as a corporation, or should you? Well, it has to do largely with how much money you're putting into the business and how much, how expensive the business is to run. So I'll use a very simple example. Let's say you're a massage therapist and you start a mobile massage therapy business. Your overhead is very minimal. We'll talk more about expenses later, but for simplicity, let's say you've had to buy yourself a massage table. You've already got a car, so you didn't really need to invest in that. You bought some oils, maybe a couple sets of sheets and some scrubs. You might be at $1,000 of overhead at this point in time. Now, because of that, you don't really have any expenses. And due to that fact, if for whatever reason your business fails, you don't have any debt. There's nothing to pay off, so it's no big deal. Now, let's say, for example, maybe you're going to be a chiropractor at this point in time, or a physiotherapist, or even a massage therapist, the modality doesn't matter, and you choose to start a brick and mortar business, meaning you go downtown in your local town or city and you find a nice location and you sign the lease and you're taking over responsibility for this place. And then you do renovations, and then you hire staff, and you do all the things to start this brick and mortar business. Well, that costs a lot of money. Now, you can technically do that as a sole proprietor, but you'll likely have to get a loan. You go to the bank, you get a loan, and there's complexity to that. We'll talk about it a little bit later, but let's assume the bank gives you a loan for $100,000. And there you are as a sole proprietor with a $100,000 loan in a clinic. And unfortunately, in this example, let's say that clinic fails for whatever reason. You can't sustain it any longer, but you've still got that debt. Well, as a sole proprietor, you are responsible for that debt. It's all on you, which means if you can't pay that back from income in your business, you as an individual, you've got to pay it back somehow. And that might mean you sell your car, you remortgage your house. You might even have to file personal bankruptcy. So you see, as a sole proprietor, an advantage is it's super easy. It's a very low cost to start, but a disadvantage is as you grow and expand, any liability, that's 100% on you. Yeah, so if you're doing business under any name but your own, you must register it as a trade name. Now, this is another interesting part about a sole proprietor. Sole proprietorship is largely done based on your name. So my name is Jess Reynolds, right? And let's say I want to start my acupuncture business. I can very simply just say Jess Reynolds Acupuncture. I can operate under my own name. And that's what the vast majority of people do when they start. When you write a receipt, you write a receipt with your name, Jess Reynolds. I perform this service. You gave me this much money. Here you go. And it really is that easy. And if you are operating just with your name, you really don't need to register anything. You truly don't have to go through the process. Even if you open a bank account, a business bank account, which I would strongly encourage you to do, you still do not need to register a business name. But let's say I don't want to call my business just my name. I want to call it a very specific name, and it's called Acupuncture for Arthritis. Yeah, that's a great name. So it's called Acupuncture for Arthritis. That's the name I've decided to call my business. Well, the moment I decide to call my business its own name, now I have to register my business. And again, where you go to register your business varies depending on the country you're living in, but it's relatively simple. In Canada, we go to the local registry, and in the States, I believe you register with the IRS. Nevertheless, all this can be done online now. So that registration, the name you choose to call yourself, determines whether or not you actually have to register your business name. And the cost of that, it's quite minimal. Again, depending on where you are, it can range anywhere from $30 up to a couple $100, but relatively minimal. Now, another benefit is taxes are super simple. What I mean is it's basically just your personal taxes. There's nothing strange about it. It's the same paperwork. It's the same forms. There's nothing unusual about it. So sole proprietorship, this is what most people are going to start their business as. But maybe you've decided to expand your business, or maybe you've graduated school with somebody and you two together have decided, hey, let's start a business together. In which case you have another option, and that's called a partnership. Now, a partnership by definition is owned by two or more people. That's important. It's not just two, it's two or more. It's very easy to set up. It's less expensive than an LLC that's a corporation. But a verbal agreement, it's all you need. You really can just shake hands and say, we're going to do this together, and it's going to be beautiful. Nevertheless, in bold, with stars around it, sign a contract. There's this saying in business, and the saying goes like this: the only ship guaranteed to sink is a partnership. Maybe it's not necessarily true. It's maybe not guaranteed to sink, but that saying exists for a reason in the world of business. It's because partnerships are notoriously challenging. There's pros to them. The pro would be you are going to share liability. I'll bring the slide back up so you can see what I mean by share liability. So you share the finances and you share the risk. So again, this is based on you going together, you decide to get a $100,000 loan, and based on that contract, it's 50-50. You're both 50% liable. So what that means is, again, terrible scenario, but let's assume in this case the business fails. Well, you are both 50% liable for any of the debt. Now that's really great. But here's the downside, is no matter what, you are both 50% liable. And you both have total control over the business. So let's say you've got a partner, it's just you and this partner, and you both have a business credit card. And the credit card limit is $50,000. Your business partner does not have to run anything by you. They've got that credit card. They can go buy whatever they want. They can rack up as much debt as that credit card will allow without having to ask you about it at all. You could do the same. So let's say your business partner goes and racks up a whole bunch of debt, and then they decide they don't really want to work in the business anymore. They want to pursue their career as an artist, and they just kind of bail on you. And then the business fails. What that means is your partner made a whole bunch of terrible business decisions. They racked up a ton of debt, and you are still 50% liable. So that's certainly a risk to a partnership. Pro is, you can share that if you're on perfect terms. The risk is you also have to pay if they make a mistake, and vice versa. If you do, they have to pay. All right. Now, you can either incorporate or not. We'll talk about incorporation in a moment as a partnership. And taxes, well, they're a little bit more complex, but not that much more complex. And again, I don't want to necessarily give any advice, say do this or don't do that, but this is one of the times where I'd strongly discourage you from starting a partnership. Not only is it a very high likelihood of the business failing, but it's also very stressful on the relationship. Be it a friend, a classmate, or a significant other, going into business with somebody, it's very challenging. Can be done, but I just want to make it known that it's super challenging, puts a lot of pressure on relationships. Okay, and then we get into corporations. Now, corporations, they're owned by business owners. This was actually a question that came up quite a bit in the questions that were submitted before we started here. When should a person incorporate? Should a person incorporate? Well, we'll talk about these main points and then we'll dig into that. So corporation, it's technically owned by shareholders. Now, an LLC, this is a limited liability company. They're not the same. Like an LLC and a corporation, they're technically not the same, but they're close enough that I'm going to use the terms interchangeably. You can indeed have more than one owner. Now, in the States, not in Canada, in fact, only in the States, there's this thing called an S Corp. And again, it doesn't exist anywhere else but the States. And it's, for many people, it's a better way to go when it comes to incorporating. But there's a lot more specific requirements that vary depending on your particular modality as well as your state. So S Corps exist, but I'm not going to talk about them because with the exception of the States, they don't really apply and they're much more complicated. So I'm just going to talk about corporations, which are basically the same as LLCs. All right, so with a corporation, we have limited liability. Shareholders are not liable for debt. This is the biggest perk. Shareholders are not liable for debt. So what that means is, now my company, I own a company called AIM Online Education, and it is a corporation. And when I started my corporation, during the process of signing the paperwork, one of the questions was, how many shares do you want? And they typically suggest just start with 1,000 for whatever arbitrary reason. So there's 1,000 shares within my company. Now, I am the only person who owns shares, meaning I own the company. If I wanted to sell my company, I actually have to sell my shares. And it turns out the person who owns the largest percentage of shares is essentially the one who gets to make the decisions. So these days, particularly in the last few months, right, you might be familiar with the fact that Elon Musk bought Twitter. He didn't buy Twitter. He bought the majority of shares. He holds a higher percentage of shares than any of the other shareholders, which means he essentially gets to make the decisions. Now, that doesn't really matter when it comes to your business as a clinic owner, because if you choose to incorporate, yes, you have to decide on how many shares, but the likelihood of you selling shares, or what's called going public, it's basically non-existent. The reason this does matter, though, is because this is how a partnership takes place within a corporation, is you will both earn or own, a certain percentage, 50% of the shares. So it's based on shares more than anything else. Now that gets a little bit too in the weeds, and I don't want to spend any more time on it because again, it's really not relevant to you. But what is a very important part is the shareholders are not liable for any debt. That's that main point there. Going back to that same example, you decide to start a brick and mortar business, you go to the bank, you get a loan for $100,000 and the business fails. The business has failed, not you. What that means is you as an individual are not at all liable for any debt. Now, does that mean you can go ahead and start a business, get a $100,000 loan, buy all of these things, and then just do whatever you want, take advantage of the system? No, rest assured, there are a lot of systems in place that people don't necessarily abuse the system of incorporating, but it's a very smart way to go if you plan on, or if you need to, incur quite a bit of debt. Because again, if things fail, the business fails, not you. Yeah, the business owns all of the massage tables. The business owns all of the furniture. The business owns all of the decorations. So if it fails, that's all gone. But you don't have to remortgage your house. You are not personally liable. So to answer the big question, should you incorporate? Well, it really has to do with how much debt are you planning on incurring, and are you planning on starting a brick and mortar? Now, they seem to go hand in hand. But with brick and mortars, the reason I say how much debt versus are you going to start a brick and mortar is you can certainly incur a lot of debt when you are maybe working out of your house. So if you're working out of your house, maybe you've decided to renovate your entire basement to be a clinic space. Well, that can mean you incur about $50,000 of debt. So that's one option. Are you incurring debt? Next option. Are you starting a brick and mortar? Once you start a brick and mortar, there are so many other legalities involved, everything from insurance to hiring employees and contractors, that it's simply easier to do so as a corporation, which leads me into my next point. When you incorporate, you actually have higher credibility. What I mean by credibility is not like you get to walk around at a family get together and everybody's like, "Oh, you've got to." No, I don't mean that. I mean in banks. When you go to a bank, it's much easier to get a loan as a corporation than it is to get a loan as an individual. So you have a higher credibility. It's easier to access capital gains, capital and grants. There are a lot of government grants available, and while the government is incredibly interested in small businesses succeeding, they're even more interested in small businesses that are incorporated succeeding. So it's much easier to get grants and funding. And there is a lower tax rate. For better or worse, the way that our financial system is set up is corporations pay significantly less taxes. Without getting too far into the weeds of taxes, as an individual, on average, 25% is a fair estimate for an individual's income tax. Again, this varies wildly depending on which province or state or country. For the sake of argument, let's say a personal or an individual pays 25% tax. Now, technically, corporations are supposed to pay around 30%. So their tax margins are actually supposed to be higher. But because there are so many loopholes as far as what is actually taxable income, at the end of it, corporations tend to pay closer to 10%. These are rough numbers. Don't take any of this as gospel, but what I mean to say is corporations pay less in taxes. Now, one might think, well, I want to pay less in taxes. I might as well just incorporate right now. True, you could do that. Nothing's stopping you. But there's also a lot more expenses in running a corporation. So as a sole proprietor, your yearly expenses for running the business, they're minimal. Like you've registered your business for $30. That's it. As a corporation, on the other hand, they're more expensive to start and they're more expensive to maintain. Every year you have to refile your corporate papers. You have to, there's a lot more paperwork involved. And I was about to go down the things you have to do, but we'll leave that for now. The fact is there's just more paperwork, and an accountant is highly recommended. In fact, where I am, accountants aren't just highly recommended, they're in fact required. I, as an individual, I cannot file my corporate taxes. I have to hire a CPA. This is a professional accountant to file my taxes. Might be different where you live, but I have to. And accountants, they're not cheap. I could do my own bookkeeping, but I cannot file my own corporate taxes. And that bill for myself typically comes out to around $2,000 per year. So simply to stay incorporated, the fees, bare minimum, assuming all you're paying for is your annual incorporation fees and your accountant, you're probably looking at about $3,000. So keep that in mind, right? It's like the expenses to operate are more. Yeah, you get a cut on taxes, but pros and cons. Ultimately, it's up to you to decide which one is best for your type of business. Right. So yes, I guess that's it for corporations. The last point I want to make is it doesn't really matter which one you choose because you can change back. As a sole proprietor, you can quite easily transition and change into a corporation. As in a corporation, you can dissolve the corporation and go back to sole proprietorship. So these decisions aren't written in stone. It's not like this is the thing you decide to do and now you're stuck with it. No, you can change at any point in time. Same thing with a partnership. You can change. So this decision, while it is important when you begin, it's not necessarily written in stone. Okay, so let's move on to our next topic, which is going to be choosing a business name. Oh, choosing a business name. I laugh at this one because I have gone through so many business names. If many of you have started your own business, that's one of the things, right? Like, what should I call my business? And it takes a long time to come up with these business names. And this is one of those things that you can't really change. You can, but I'll tell you, it's a real pain. So when I first started my business, my education business specifically, I called myself Academy of Integrative Medicine. And I thought it was a brilliant name because it turned into AIM for short. And then, so happy with it. And then I realized it turns out people have a hard time spelling integrative. So that was an issue. And writing the entire website name, Academy of Integrative Medicine, people would make tons of spelling errors, even my email address. So then I shortened it, Academy of IMED. Like, okay, well, now they don't have to spell integrative, but am I Academy of Integrative Medicine or am I Academy of IMED? And it was like 2 years of reiterating this name until eventually nobody knew what to call me. It was a mess. So starting out by really spending as much time as necessary to ensure that your business name is perfect, that's worth it. Because while you can change it later on, it is a big pain. So here's a few tips when coming up with your business name. One, make it short and make it easy to spell. That should be a high priority. People are going to be typing your business name into Google and search engines and Facebook often. Make it easy to spell and make it super short. My first business, Academy of Integrative Medicine, sounds great, but ultimately it wasn't ideal because of how long it is and how many people would misspell it. I actually worked for a college for a number of years. Love the place. It's called the Calgary College of Traditional Chinese Medicine and Acupuncture. What a mouthful. Right? Like this, it was ridiculously long. And nobody ever called it that. It was always CCTCMA. And even as an acronym, it's incredibly long. So just keep that in mind is people will search you based on your name. The easier it is to spell, the shorter it is, the easier time your potential clients are going to have in finding you. Next, as a sole proprietor, using your name is perfectly okay. Now, this is actually a very important distinction. If you want to register your business, right? So you've decided I'm Jess Reynolds. That's what I do. And I decide to register and I go to the registry and I say, I want to register my business. And they say, what's your business name? And I go, Jess Reynolds. This is kind of confusing, but you cannot register your name unless you're a lawyer or a medical doctor. If you're one of those two, go ahead. But for the rest of us, we cannot register our name as a business name. So this is the confusion. I can go ahead and use my name up until the point I choose to register. And then I have to do something else. I have to say Jess Reynolds Acupuncture or Jess Reynolds Massage Acupuncture and Hypnotherapy, whatever it is. So you can simply use your name unless you want to register, in which case you have to change it. Now, funnily enough, though, I would recommend if you choose to register your name, do not include your personal name in it for a number of reasons. And we'll get into those reasons in a moment. Try not to include your region or neighborhood. So there's two things I say don't do. Don't include your name if you want to register your business, and don't include your neighborhood or region. And the main reason being is what happens if you want to move. And you might be thinking, there's no way I'm moving. I'm staying in my community for the rest of my life. Perfect. Awesome. I support that. But then what happens if your business grows to the point you want to expand into another community? For example, I live in a community called Prestwick. That sounds like a great name, Prestwick Acupuncture. And maybe I've decided I'm here for the rest of my life. Well, all of a sudden, maybe I want to move into a community that's on the other side of the city and start a second location. If I call it Prestwick Acupuncture, that gets quite confusing. And the same thing goes is don't include your city or your town, because what happens if you do move? You can't really bring that name along with you. And the same thing goes with your name. Now, we're in an era of personal brands, right? That's the social media world. Build a personal brand. Nevertheless, using your name as, say, Jess Reynolds Acupuncture, it's not great. Because what happens if I choose to sell my business? People buying a business that's based on my name, it's much less likely. So try not to use your name, try not to use your location. If you already have done so, no sweat, but if you're choosing a new name, do your best to avoid those two. You do want to be industry specific. And this also kind of depends on what your ultimate goals are. Here's what I mean, industry specific. Is what industry are you in? Well, I'm assuming pretty much everybody here is in the wellness industry. So you can keep it as we'll say, wonderful wellness clinic. Sure, it sounds great. And as I come up with these names, they're mostly terrible. So forgive me for that. But Wonderful wellness. And that's perfect because it has what I do in the name. I do wellness. Now, you could niche down a little bit more and you could include your specific modality, acupuncture or massage or physiotherapy or aesthetics or whatever it is you do, no problem, with one small exception, and it has to do with expansion. When you choose a name, choosing a name for what you're doing today makes sense. One thing I would encourage you to do is think about the possible future. What happens if you own a salon and you want to start including more modalities? Or you're a massage therapist, but you want to include some acupuncture, or maybe you want to bring a psychologist in. So including the specific niche-based modality, this is not a problem if that's all you want to work with. A good friend of mine, she has a clinic called Inhale, Exhale Massage Therapy, and that's all she wants to do, really. Like, she made that decision consciously. It's just a massage practice, in which case, perfect, brilliant name. If you choose to expand, try just including a little bit more broad concept of a wellness or whatever industry you're in more specifically. I hope that makes sense. All right, consider future growth, great. Perform a name search on Google. That's a very first step, right? I actually did that with my first company, Academy of Integrative Medicine. And I saw there was another company, and they were in New York, which is not only on the opposite side of the continent, but in a different country than I'm in. Right. So I'm in Canada, I'm near the West Coast, and they were on the East Coast of the States. And I'm like, oh, no big deal. No, I'll never have a problem. We're never going to cross paths with these people, Academy of Integrative Medicine. So it was a slight difference. They were Academy of Integrative and Holistic Medicine, right? And I was calling myself Academy of Integrative Medicine. And I'm like, no, this is fine. This is fine. There. Oh, I was so wrong. I once went to a conference, and sure enough, we both showed up. Both of us ended up at the same conference, and there was so much confusion. So do a Google name search. If somebody else in your industry, regardless of where they are, has the same name, try and come up with a different one. Now, if you are a wellness business and you don't really intend on moving to a different city, it's not as big of a problem. Again, this has to do with what you plan on doing in the future. Nevertheless, do a Google name search and try and come up with something unique that nobody else has come up with, which can be challenging, but I've got some more suggestions for that. Now, you can verify the name is not taken, and you could do so by going to the registry. You could do a legal name search, and these cost between $30 and $100 depending on where you are. But ultimately, this is your last step, is do your name search. So coming up with a name, challenging. You could sit down with some friends. You can try and come up with a name together. Do your best to come up with something unique. Whether it's potentially, and interestingly enough, somewhat controversial, but in this weird world we're in, one of the easiest things to do is just use artificial intelligence. Just type in, my business is, type in your entire business in as much detail as possible and say, give me a list of 30 business names, and it will pop out 30 unique business names. And it's a pretty interesting way to come up with a business name now. So you could try that as well, perhaps. Okay, let's jump into the next topic. And again, if you do have questions, by all means, throw them in the Q&A and we'll get to them at the end. So we're registering. You've decided on your business structure, you've decided on your business name, and now you're going to register your business. It's not always necessary, which we've discussed, but my recommendation is you should probably do it anyways. My assumption is, this is an assumption, so if you do not fall into this criteria, my apologies, but my assumption is you want to grow your business. My assumption is you want to build a business that's sustainable, that's big enough that maybe one day you can take a step back and still have some income coming from this business. So ultimately, the idea here is growth. Because that's the end goal, that's why I suggest you might as well just register in the beginning. Canada, it's a registry, IRS in the United States. You can register within each province or state. It can be done online or in person. I prefer doing it online. Owner.com in Canada, inkfile.com in the United States. It's the easiest way. When I was registering my corporation, is I looked at how much it would cost me to hire somebody to help me with this process. And to register as an incorporation was going to cost, I think, $2,500 Canadian, which would work out to something like $3,200 American. And I'm like, this is bizarre how expensive it is. And then I went onto owner.com and I could register, do the whole process. It took me about 20 minutes and it filed all the paperwork and it cost me $800. And at the time, there was actually a deal with a bank, RBC if you're in Canada, where if I registered using owner, RBC gave me $300 when I started an RBC account. So I say all of this to say, when you are starting your business and you're registering it, I would strongly encourage you to do so online. It's much easier, it's much cheaper, and there's certain incentives as well. Cool. Now we move on to the next topic, which is going to be permits, license, professional registration, insurance, all that fun stuff. If you've been practicing for a while, you've probably got this stuff figured out. For those of you who are just starting, this will be quite important for you. And as I've said many times, I hate to sound like a broken record here, rules change depending on city, depending on county, state, province. For example, in the city that I'm in, if you are a massage therapist, you have to register with the city. If you're an acupuncturist, you do not. If you move just outside of the city, like literally the town on the city limits, as a massage therapist, you do not have to register with that town. As an acupuncturist, you do. So this is to say registration as a wellness business. This isn't your business name. This is telling the city you live in, saying, hey, I live in Calgary. Hey, Calgary, I'm practicing massage. Sometimes you have to tell the city that you are practicing as a wellness practitioner. Now, I wish I could give you a spreadsheet and a guideline, but the fact is your best bet is to simply contact your town hall or city hall and ask, I'm a, whatever you are, counselor. I'm a massage therapist. Do I have to register with the town or city? But note, take this step. If you haven't already, take the step. You might have been operating the last however many years without a permit and actually need one. So that's essentially what permits are. Now, another interesting thing is I run my home, my clinic out of my home. And in the city I live in, you do not need a business license, a license to operate a business out of your home, unless you are seeing more than 10 people per week are coming to the house. Yeah, I think that's the threshold. So it gets even more confusing. It's like, do I have less than 10? In which case, I don't need the permit. If I have more than 10, then I need the permit. So again, to reinforce the fact that it really is different everywhere. And to reinforce what a permit is essentially the city knows that you are running a business, either out of your home or some other location. Some places require them, some places don't. Okay. Permit to operate, yeah, that's it. So I've got a permit, we've got a license to operate a business. So a license, if you're a wellness practitioner, there's a good chance that you have a license, and the license comes from your association. So where I live, we've got an acupuncture association, then I've got my license to practice acupuncture, and then other cities, states, provinces, massage therapists either do or don't. Essentially, this is telling the government, I have the appropriate schooling, I have passed the exams, and I am allowed to operate as this practitioner. And again, it does vary from one place to another. In the province that I live in, massage therapy is not licensed, meaning it's not regulated. You do not need a license to practice massage. In the next province over, British Columbia, you do need a license to practice massage. So it changes from one place to another. Hopefully, the school that you went through prepared you for whether or not you do or do not need a license. Okay. Registration as a wellness provider, we've been through that already. And then get insurance. Now, insurance is its own big thing, but just man, get insurance. So I have this business course. It's called Business Basics, where I talk all about insurance. I don't want to dig into it here, but it doesn't really matter if you are a Reiki master or a yoga teacher, an acupuncturist. I don't really care what modality you practice. Get insurance. It will really save your bacon. I mean, hopefully nothing ever happens, but if anything ever happens, if maybe you're a Reiki master and you're doing some crystal bowl stuff and you drop the bowl on them and break a nose or something like that, give them a black eye. Insurance is going to cover you if they decide to sue you. So that would be one of my main recommendations at this point is no matter what you're practicing, get insurance. Great. I think enough said on insurance. Which does get us into legalities, permits, and legal obligations. Do you need a lawyer? No, you don't need a lawyer. You do not need a lawyer to start a business. You need to sign some paperwork. You need to file the paperwork. You can do all of this on your own using the online systems we talked about. It's very simple and straightforward. You do not need a lawyer. But if you have any questions at all, ask a lawyer. Different places have different free services. Universities are a great place to go for free legal advice. And they're usually a fairly short wait period, and maybe you'll get half an hour of one-on-one consultation with a law student. It's a great place to get legal advice. Online services, there's a website called Law Depot. Law Depot is amazing for getting contracts, and they're good. They're good contracts. You'll probably want to modify them ever so slightly, or if you're very concerned, you'll get a Law Depot contract and then run it past the lawyer. But you can do this for like $40 on Law Depot. Now, as a medical professional, you are obligated to keep records. And this is a very important point, that if you get somebody's first name, that's not a legal document. If you get the first name and last name, also not a legal document. If you get their first name, last name, and birth date, legal document. That birth date matters. So if in your practice you get somebody's birth date, it's turned into a legal document, and legal documents have very specific criteria for what you do with them, how you store them. So if you are getting any personal information from your clients whatsoever, and the vast majority of wellness practitioners do, we almost always collect personal information, it is a legal document. As such, you have very specific criteria. Now, fortunately, if you're using a system such as Jane, this stuff is dealt for you, right? The legal documents, it's HIPAA compliant and PIPEDA compliant, so you don't have to really worry. But if you choose to do pen and paper style, and I mean, heaven forbid you choose to use Google Docs or Microsoft Word, which I say just do not do. There's ways to make it legal, but don't. Let's say use paper and pen. The fact is there are still requirements in order to do so. If you collect personal information, you also need a consent form, meaning here's what I am going to do. You are legally required to get a consent form. There's a big difference between a consent and waiver. Consent means the person consents to treatment. Waiver means that they waive the right to sue you. There might be some exceptions to this that I'm unaware of, but as far as I know, wellness practitioners cannot get their clients to sign a waiver. We can only get our clients to consent. That's an important distinction. Again, a legal document, anything with a name, great, that's fine. Duration. The duration of retention of documents varies depending on the modality you practice and where you live, but 5 to 10 years is average. Most places, it's somewhere in that range, meaning if you have a legal document, you are required to keep that document for between 5 and 10 years. And if you are using pen and paper, that's unfortunate because the requirements also mean you have to keep, and this is confusing. I don't want to dig too deep into it, but you have to keep the documents for 10 years after the last time you saw the client, or 10 years from their 18th birthday. The fact is you have to keep this paperwork for 10 years. And if you see a lot of clients, that's a lot of paperwork. And the laws vary again, but the majority of them say the paperwork has to be kept in a waterproof, fireproof container, which means you need to have a box that's waterproof and fireproof for your documents for 10 years. Yet another one of the million reasons why I would strongly encourage, if you haven't already, starting to use something like Jane. Makes life so much easier. Okay, carrying on. Contractor versus employee. How are we doing for time here? Okay, great. Yeah, we're doing okay. We'll go through contractor, employee, and then we'll talk startup costs, and then we'll get into question and answer, if that sounds good. Contractor versus employee. This is probably the biggest question I get, other than marketing questions, but contractor, employee. When you work at a clinic for somebody else, this is the key. This is not a business owner. This is you working for somebody else. You are either going to be employed or hired as a contractor or an employee. As a contractor, you have control over the hours you work. You have control over your hourly rate. You have to provide your own equipment, your tools. You have to provide all of that, and you are responsible for paying your own taxes. and you do not receive benefits. So I'm going to talk about this in contrast to employee, and then I will compare them back and forth. As an employee, you have less control over your schedule. You have to follow company policies and procedures. The clinic chooses the hourly rate. The clinic is responsible for supplies, and the clinic pays taxes. The clinic pays for sick days. The clinic pays for all of those extra things. You also might be eligible for benefits from the clinic. Now, if you've worked for some other company prior to getting into the wellness industry, let's say you did a sales job in the mall, you were an employee, they paid you an hourly wage, and they did tax deductions on your paycheck. That's an employee. You started a job and they said, I'm going to pay you $15 an hour for this job. And you said, okay, that's an employee. Now, as a contractor, and that's really what the vast majority of us are, we are contractors. This is where we get a little bit of gray area, because technically, as a contractor, I can walk into a clinic and the clinic says, I would like to hire you, acupuncturist. And I say, okay, I am going to work Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday for these hours. That's it. And I charge $100 per session. Now, technically, that should be the way it goes. Technically, I, as a contractor, should have say over these things. And this is the gray area comes in, because sometimes the clinic goes, well, I only need an acupuncturist on Mondays and Fridays, and my clinic charges $90 for acupuncture. So it's interesting, right? Because now the clinic has chosen the working hours. The clinic has chosen the fee. So are you a contractor or are you an employee? There's certainly gray area. Now, ultimately, it has to do with the final agreement between you and the clinic owner. Are you going to operate as a contractor or employee? And the biggest distinction here is who's paying taxes. At the end of the month, does the clinic just give you a check? And the check is for the number of hours you worked and the commission or the percentage rate that you got. And then you then pay your own taxes. That's the biggest indicator that you are a contractor. On the other hand, does the clinic hold back taxes and pay the government the taxes for you? That's the biggest indication you are an employee. And the reason I spend time on this and why I think it's such an important thing is I've talked to a lot of clinic owners and a lot of people working at a clinic, and this is a big area of contention, because a practitioner will walk in and say, I'm a contractor. I have control over my schedule, so I'm going to take next month off. And the clinic owner goes, well, no, I need somebody here next month. So the clinic owner treats the person like a contractor. The contractor obviously doesn't like that. But the fact is, the clinic owner needs somebody there next month. So I wish I could give you an answer and say, this is how it's done. But what I really want to emphasize here is when it comes to clinic contractor versus employee discussion, you have to have this with the clinic. If you are choosing to work for a clinic, you need to have this discussion and you need to make it abundantly clear. Maybe you want to have freedom over your schedule, in which case, when you first start working for the clinic, you need to tell them, hey, listen, I want control over my schedule. I'm going to take days off when I want to take days off. I want to be able to log into Jane and choose my days that I'm off. If I want to book a day off next week, I'm going to book a day off next week. And maybe that's what you want. And if that's the case, you need to make sure that's clear ahead of time. Some clinics will be perfectly okay with this, others won't. But that discussion must be had ahead of time. Okay. I think we're doing okay. Okay, I think that's a good place to shift into question and answer. And the reason I shift in there is, although I said we've got all these other topics that we're going to go through, they're relatively simple. I mean, I could summarize startup costs very easily by saying it's mostly going to be registration, accounts, licensing fees, insurance. Those are your big startup costs. The rest are optional. You really don't need to do these rest of these optional ones. Yeah, I think that's a good place to put there. So we are at that Q&A time. Yeah, we'll move into the Q&A now. So I'll take a look at the Q&A section and by all means continue to ask. Let's see, the first question here comes from Anonymous. Thanks for the information. What about when you are asked to ask as a guarantor for business debt? Oh, so just if you can reiterate this. I'm not sure I fully understand when you are asked to act as a guarantor for business debt. Does that explain to apply? Are you essentially asking a co-signer? If not, can you clarify that question for me? It's just anonymous, so I'm not sure who asked that question, and I'll get back to that further down. Next, Daniel says, I have a personal question for you. I live in Montreal and would like to have your opinion on regarding where you study TCMD. Thanks in advance. Happy to answer that. I studied in Calgary. I studied through the Calgary College of Traditional Chinese Medicine and Acupuncture. And it is a nationally regulated profession, so it doesn't really matter where you study. At the end of it, you have to take the same exam no matter where you are. And I hope that answers your question. If you would like, I'll put my email up on the screen shortly, and I'll give that to everybody. So you can certainly send me a personal email, Daniel, and I'm more than happy to discuss all of that with you. I'll put that up just here in a second. So I'll get to the next question here. Chat. Where I lost my Q&A window. There it is. I have registered corporation with a numbered name. Do I need to register or do a business name? Oh, brilliant. Thank you. That's a really good question, Mona. I didn't actually address a numbered corporation. Yeah. So when you register as a corporation, you can simply choose to register as a numbered corporation. And there are certainly pros and cons to this. One is you can then technically choose to call yourself whatever you want. It kind of depends on where you are, whether or not that's okay or not. What I mean is, if you're a numbered corporation, you can't have a let's say a flyer going out with your business name, as well as it's hard to answer. I'm going to try and simplify this. If you only have a numbered corporation, you can't really use any name. Simple as that. There are ways you can kind of dance around it, but to keep it simple, if you're just a numbered corporation and you want to start advertising as a specific company, you're going to want to choose your company name. This might vary depending on where you live, but for the most part, numbered companies and corporations, they're typically used just for buying assets. Meaning you're just a numbered corporation and you buy other businesses, and then you will operate those businesses under their business names. So neither good nor bad, but ultimately at some point you might want to register as a business name. Michelle, how does offering telehealth services in other regions impact your business registration and permits? Yeah. It's a very interesting thing when we get into telehealth, because telehealth technically qualifies as e-business. And this is a fairly confusing area. What I mean is, I'm just going to use where I live, for example. I'm not sure where you, Michelle, but where I live, there's a provincial sales tax, and there are provincial rules based on what I'm allowed to practice. And I can't practice, say, for example, I'm going to choose hypnotherapy. Yeah, I can't practice hypnotherapy outside of where I'm regulated necessarily. But since it's online, there's currently not a lot of rules with different modalities. Coaching is a really good example. If you're a counselor or psychologist, things change. As a psychologist, you have to be registered within your local region. And some states and provinces will not allow telehealth from other states or provinces. Some will. So this is to say, it really varies place to place. Now, I'm not really a fan of trying to find ways to tiptoe around the laws and legalities, but the fact is what you call yourself matters, because if you call yourself a consultant or a coach, then you can technically see somebody anywhere. This also changes depending on where the individual has health insurance. Let's assume you're a counselor and they have health insurance for counseling. Well, their health insurance company, which is based in their state, might not accept health or counselors from other states. So there's a lot of gray area here. And then additionally, it has to do with how much income are you making from other states and provinces. Different states and provinces have different thresholds. For example, in the one province over, it's called Saskatchewan, is if I do even one sale, if I take money from one person who lives in Saskatchewan, I have to register in Saskatchewan as a business. Whereas, say, for example, Louisiana, the state, unless I make $100,000 from Louisiana people, I do not have a register of business there. So all of this is to say, Michelle, and I hate this answer. I hate it because it's not helpful. It's complicated and it varies dramatically. Again, I'm happy to dig into this and help your case specifically. I will put my email up, and by all means, send me an email and we'll dig into all of these questions. Anonymous, okay.
Jess, I just wanted to come in and do a quick time check because we are 3 minutes to 11. We're happy to stick on and answer some more questions, but I did just want to say to anyone that might have to pop off, by all means, this session is being recorded. As we said, we'll get through some more of the questions for everybody, but feel free to pop off if you have to. We can stay on for a bit longer and go through more of the Q&A as well. And then I did just, there is one that was moved to the dismiss tab because Jack answered on the Jane perspective, but if you want to pop over there and see if you want to add anything else for there.
All right, will do. Great, thank you. So I tend to talk a lot, so my apologies for continuing to speak so much, and I thank you for that. I'm just going to put in my email here. My email, and maybe Jack, you could put that in the comments. My email, and I'm very open to emails. It's just jess@aimonline.com. I'll see if I can post that in there. Yeah, I'll do it as well. jess@aimonline.com. My website is aimonline.com. I love questions. I'm very much open to them. So by all means, do so. Great information. Thank you. Just wanted to be a contractor. So the next question is, if just starting out and wanted to be a contractor, how or where do you suggest we find out what rates to charge? Oh man, rates. What a big conversation. Like that's its own big thing. You know what? I'm going to take a little pause here and hopefully I can catch a few more people before they go away. I want to answer that question, but there's a good reason why I'm pausing. Is the number of questions that tend to come in with all of this, there's a lot. So if you go to this website, it's aimonline.com/business-jane. So not the email, just aimonline.com/business-jane. You can register for a course that it's an online course. It's about 6 hours long. And I'll tell you, I cover all of these questions in that online course. It's all pre-recorded. It's 100% free for everybody who's in the webinar. So not a cost, but again, it's a really great resource where lots of these questions will be answered. So if you don't have time to stick through this Q&A, please just register for that course. Tons of answers. And of course, my email is there as well. So by all means, ask away. I do talk all about insurance, marketing, clinic management, bunch of interviews from different clinic owners, a lot more. So certainly jump into there. So I hope that helps. I'll leave that up and answer the next question. For rates are very dependent. There is so much that goes into choosing your rate as a contractor, from your neighborhood to your modality to your education experience to this value-based model. So unfortunately, there's no this is how much you should or can charge as a contractor. Next quick question here. Do you have any suggestions of places for people to get a business coach? Example. Well, I mean, I hate to sell myself, but I'm definitely one of those. I'll put the next slide up. You can just actually, if you go to aimonline.com and check out the coaching section, just click on coaching, you will see that up there as well. aimonline.com/Dr. Jess Reynolds. You could book a call with me for business coaching, and that's a half-hour call where we just chat and get things started. We could talk about all of this type of stuff in detail. By all means, feel free to do so. Can you review taxes as a sole proprietorship? I heard you say that there's no difference from doing your personal taxes. Yeah. Can you elaborate? I can, but it is, again, a big, huge topic, of which I do cover in that free course I mentioned. But as a sole proprietor, your taxes, it really is just you. So you would then keep track of all of your income. Let's assume you do not have any other jobs. It's just you. And you have taken in $50,000 as a practitioner. Let's say you're a massage therapist. Depending on where you live, this varies, but I think you say you're in BC. Oh, yeah, that does matter. Because let's say you take in $50,000. Well, within that, you have to pay personal tax. And that means you're going to be in the tax bracket that's about 25% income tax. So you've made $50,000. That means $12,500 goes to the government. And it's the exact same as doing your personal taxes. The biggest difference is when you're an employee, the employer gives you a T4. As an employee, you're responsible for keeping track of all that same stuff. When in doubt, though, hire an accountant, or if you use something like TurboTax, just click sole proprietor, own my own business, and it will walk you through every single step. So that's actually the end of the Q&As there. So that was the last question. Wonderful. There was one more you said, Destin, where I don't see it here in the answer. There it is. Legal documentation. What's the protocol if you have a clinic, but still need access to clinic records? Yeah. Yes, great. Well, that is a perfect answer from Jack, and I'm glad, Jack, that you did answer that. And that's exactly it. Is if you're with Jane, which again, in my opinion, really is the best of them, that's something that your electronic medical record company should be keeping track of for you. And in this case, you would just get the records via zip.